Excellent. So I'm going to talk, well, first of all, thanks to Tiffany for inviting me. And I'm really excited that the Stills community is getting organized. And Tiffany asked me to talk about the importance of research. So I'm going to really talk about how research and treatment really go hand in hand for rare diseases, and weaving in my own personal experience and the foundation. So first of all, who am I? I'm the mother of a child with systemic JIA, a scientist by training, and I've been an entrepreneur. And now I run a nonprofit dedicated to SJIA. And in case there is any confusion about this, I want to clarify right at the beginning that biologically speaking, systemic JIA and Stills are the same disease. It is a historical set of, choices made by scientists at different times, due to which they are known by different names, but they really are the same disease. So if I had understood this right at the beginning, I would have probably named the foundation Stills Disease Foundation, but I learned about this later, like many of you might as well. So my history is that in February 2013, my 1-year-old boy was diagnosed with SJIA. And we started learning about it a little bit. And at first we were told that, biologics helped the disease and he was put on some biologics. But within a year, it became clear that he was not going to go into remission with biologics, at least not immediately. And he got diagnosed with another rare complication in an already rare disease called interstitial lung disease, and started with some clubbing in his fingers and toes. And he had repeated MAS episodes, which some of you might have experienced as well. Well, I used to read a lot of scientific papers about SJIA, and I had read this paper that patients who are diagnosed with this kind of lung disease often have a very bad outcome. And 70% of these kids were dying within 9 months from the pulmonary diagnosis. So that was the moment at which I said, well, my career is not more important than this. And I started thinking about how do we actually help my child and other patients like him. So my son was patient 1 who we found, and then not found, who was diagnosed. And then we started the search for other patients. And now, of course, I've learned a lot about rare disease organizations and how they work towards a cure. And our foundation is now part of a program with 29 other organizations. But at that point, I was just starting off without knowing any of this, with just the bet that we could help my son. So the first thing we did was that we worked with a researcher. This was at that point, I was at Stanford, going to Stanford Hospital. We worked with a researcher to organize the first research conference focused on this lung complication in SJIA. And after that, we organized several other research conferences since then, in probably about once in every 2 years about. And what we do is that we bring together patients, researchers, clinicians, regulators from FDA and EMA, and pharma. And we have them all sit together and we try to discuss new upcoming therapies, and of course, what patient needs are, what are we seeing in the field. And we think that by having this open communication of everybody understanding each other, we can make things move faster. So that is one of our important goals. The second thing we do is that we organize these family conferences, and so far they've been really focused on systemic JIA, which is the pediatric version of the disease. Hopefully when COVID ends, we hope to go back, we'll be able to include Stills as well. Our last virtual conference, we did include Stills. One of the things we do during those conferences is encourage patients to participate in research, and we have collect samples, and almost every family attending the conference participates in research. And that has been a very important thing that our foundation has been able to support, where now there's biobanks with samples from these conferences, which has helped researchers understand more about the disease. Because see, in a rare disease, it can take a researcher 10 years to collect the type of samples that patients can help them collect very fast. And that helps all of us. So how do we actually help patients? And we really believe in care and research going hand in hand. So we have, I don't do all this myself. We have a network of patients who help and work in the same way with other patients. All of these patients typically have children with refractory disease, and they've learned enough about the disease to help other newly diagnosed patients. And we really believe that it's patients who can explain to each other the importance of participating in research. We've helped many patients get connected with experts, including sometimes get urgent help. And we help the community connect and build up. We used to at in-person conferences and now virtual. And one of the things we've learned by doing all this is by these samples that have been collected at all these conferences that we've organized and other ways as well, is that a lot of the refractory patients actually have high IL-18 and sometimes elevated CXCL9 as well. And these refractory patients also tend to have MAS. And there's a bunch of drugs that are currently approved for SJIA, but these patients, even after trying those biologics and trying different immunosuppressants, the IL-18, et cetera, still can remain elevated. And this chart shows, this is brought from a paper by Dr. Scott Canna, and it shows how this IL-18 is elevated in SJIA anyway, but these particular patients that I'm talking about with a history of MAS, they can have chronic elevation of IL-18, et cetera. So it seems like these are good biomarkers, and you're going to hear further about this later on in the this session. Now, coming back to the lung disease. So, we started with one patient, my child, and now we have, at least worked with 50 different families between the patients we know directly and through other doctors we work with. So we've gone, and that's the really important part in rare disease, is that it's very hard to understand patterns through one patient. You really need multiple patients in order to understand patterns. And so by collecting all these patients and bringing them to doctors, we've helped everybody, and I've helped my child as well. So this is where I encourage all of you to learn about your disease, to participate in research. It's really important. And what have we learned about this disease, this lung disease, is that many of these patients have repeated MAS. They have very elevated IL-18 and CXCL9, and they have inadequate response to the IL-1 and IL-6 blocking biologics. Now, I'll be honest, I don't know much about this elevation of IL-18 and CXCL9 in the Still's disease, but there are papers showing that that's the case in Still's disease as well. And for patients with a history of MAS, it can be really helpful to try to get your IL-18 and CXCL9 measured, and you can do those as send out labs. I'll come back to that later. Now, why do research and treatment go hand in hand for a disease like SJIA? One of the reasons, and I borrowed this slide from permission by Dr. Scott Canna again, he has really a way of putting, framing these, is that SJIA is not Still's is not a unitary disease. It's really what's called a garbage can diagnosis. Diagnosis is by exclusion. It's by ruling out HLH. It's by ruling out infection. And then whatever is left, you put that in SJIA Still's. So that means that what goes inside SJIA Still's is not one disease. It's probably a bunch of subtypes of diseases. And right now, they're all being treated in the same way. The same set of drugs are being tried on them. But we hope that we've helped identify, this first subtype, which is these highly elevated IL-18 patients. And over the next decade, maybe they'll be able to identify more and more of these subtypes. Maybe it'll depend on different organ involvement, different biomarkers, different genetics. I mean, research is advancing in many ways. So our hope is that as we collaborate with researchers, they'll be able to help identify more and more of these subtypes of SJIA and Still's. Now, coming back to, research and treatment are tightly linked in rare diseases. This is not like getting a diagnosis of, say, diabetes, which is, you can go to many different doctors. They'll have a good understanding. They'll be able to get you the right drugs and treat you. That's not the case. When you get a diagnosis like this, especially if you have refractory disease, then you really need to get involved. Here are some things I suggest to patients with SJIA, and I would recommend to all of you, find any relevant research studies, go and search for research studies, ask other patients, look out for, posts on forums about research studies. Find other similar patients, like I went hunting for patients with lung disease and trying to understand what that is about. learn about the disease yourself, understand your labs. And if you have refractory disease, it's really a good idea to ask your rheumatologist to order these advanced labs. Some of these are IL-18, CXCL9, S100. And that will tell you what, if your disease is still active in spite of the drugs, and help you find a biomarker to follow as you try different drugs. Find clinical trials, which this session is about. Find doctors who are interested in SJIA and stills, and help them become more of experts by referring other patients. So, and how our foundation can help. Our foundation has, go to YouTube. We have a lot of videos there for you to educate yourself about research in this disease. If you sign up for our mailing list, you can learn about the events we are organizing, etc. You're welcome to email me or others from the foundation. And many of us are on the Still's disease group, so you can find us there and ask us questions, and we're happy to help if we can help in any way. And with that, I think I've actually maybe ended early so that there's some time for questions. The acknowledgements, there's a lot of patients, so some of whom have joined us today, who work with us in doing this. And we also collaborate with a lot of researchers from not just the US, but also in Europe. And we're starting to work with them more and more. We also know some researchers in Asia, but are not actively working. In terms of our foundation, we really started off with systemic JIA, but every year we are starting to get more and more involved with stills, because if it is the same disease, and our efforts that we've done for SJIA apply to stills as well. So we hope that in this year, in the next year, we'll become more involved with this community. And I have given my contact information, and feel free to contact me. Katie, I hope I was in time, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer any.